Hey everybody, welcome to the video. It's Friday, April 9th, and we're breaking down this 6-game main slate that we have over on DraftKings, and it's finally not a day slate, so you guys actually have some more time throughout the day to try to work on this and watch these videos, so I'm kind of excited about that. But if you find this video helpful in any way possible, please leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell as well, so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. And if you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. If you want access to the projections, the optimizer, ownership projections, rankings, cheat sheets, data sheets, Discord community, all that fun stuff, link is down below for that. Social media handles are in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, but I think that's it for this shameless plug. So without further ado, let's dive into today's video. And as per usual, we will start with the pitching. It's not the greatest pitching slate in the world, but it's not the worst either. But we do have some nice middle-of-the-road guys that I do think are in some viable spots here. We'll start up top with Zach Plesac at $9,600. I liked him last time versus Detroit, and I want to say he was close to 90-95% owned on that slate. Not going to be the case this time because there's other viable options, but I always like using righties versus Detroit. Even though Plesac did not have the greatest start in the world versus Detroit first time out, he only scored 12.7 fantasy points. The strikeouts weren't really there. I think he had either 4 or 5, which we're really hoping for more out of Zach Plesac. He did have close to a 30% K rate last year, but only gave up a couple runs. Unfortunately, did not get the win. They did lose that game versus Detroit, but I think times might be a little bit different here this go around versus Detroit at home in Cleveland. But only a 3.62 implied team total against him, which I believe is the lowest on the slate. I know it's the lowest between these 4 pitchers, but I do think it is the lowest in the entire slate. It's got a 63% chance for a win, 5.5 strikeout prop over in Vegas, and his numbers last year were pretty darn good at 2.28 ERA, 3.5 xFIP, but a K rate just below 30%. Had very good command as well, with only a 3% walk rate, and did limit the power as well. And like I was mentioning earlier, I always like to try to get righties versus Detroit because over the past few seasons, they have really struggled in that category. A 28.2% K rate to righties last season, a very low walk rate, low ISO, low average, low WRC plus, low WOBA. I know they got some different faces in the lineup, but it still doesn't project that well. They still don't project that well versus righties this season, so I think we can go back to Zach Plesac here, and hopefully he can have more strikeouts in his arsenal this time around, and hopefully not give up those runs that he did in the first inning last game, because I hate when pitchers give up runs in the first inning, because it just sets a bad precedent for the rest of the game. But I do like him here at home, and I think he's got a really good shot of picking up the win. And one thing I like about the Cleveland Indians pitchers is that they typically go pretty deep into the games. You don't have to worry about pitch counts with these guys because they typically get pushed to around that 100 pitch mark, so that's always nice to have a nice long leash as well for DFS purposes to try to get that extra inning that some pitchers don't happen to get early on in the season. Then dropping out of Lance McCullers, $9,100. He's a pretty good pitcher in his own right. Now, unfortunately for him, he does struggle with walks. And the next 3 guys that we're going to talk about all have walk rates close to 10%, so that can get them in trouble. But these guys are decent pitchers with K rates around 30%, so not overly concerned about it. And Vegas has the Oakland Athletics below a 4 implied team total here. McCullers is also a pretty decently sized favorite, and he's got a 6K prop over in Vegas. And this matchup versus Oakland isn't really that bad. They haven't been good to start the season, so if he can just continue to catch them on their kind of skid so far to start the year, even better for McCullers. But his first start was pretty good versus the same Oakland team, which they won 9-1 in that game. Absolutely killed them, had 24.3 fantasy points, went 5 innings, close to 100 pitches. I think he was around 94, 95, struck out 7. Overall, pretty good day. So if we can have a similar performance at home this time in Minute Maid Park, I'm all for it here. So I do like McCullers quite a bit, and he's a little bit cheaper, about $500 cheaper than Zach Plesac. So if you need the extra savings there, I think you're kind of splitting hairs between McCullers and Plesac today. Both guys have similar strikeout rates. Now, the one thing with McCullers is that he has a much higher walk rate, a 9% walk rate last season, so that can get him into some trouble. He did give up more power as well, but I love the ground balls that he has. A 60% ground ball rate, only a 22% fly ball rate. They give up quite a bit of hard contact last year, but not a lot of home runs either. But McCullers, I do think he's a very solid SP1 today, and I really think it's just the debate between Zach Plesac and Lance McCullers. You could easily play both, but if you don't want to play both and get some more bats in your lineup, it's just going to be a personal preference in your lineup. If you have the extra money, Plesac, he does look like a pretty nice option there versus Detroit, but if you have to drop down to McCullers, I have no problem with that whatsoever. Both guys are cash and GPP viable, in my opinion. Then after that, we kind of get into the SP2, so we're going to start off here with Joe Musgrove at $8,500, and a good matchup, I would say, versus the Texas Rangers. Only a 3.84 implied team total for the Rangers today. He's a pretty heavy favorite and a 6K prop, similar to Lance McCullers over in Vegas. And Joe Musgrove had a very strong season last year, a 3.19 xFIP with a 33% K rate. The one bugaboo with him is that he will walk guys at 10% walk rate, so that can get him into some trouble. But Very low hard contact rate last year at only 24.7%. They get a decent amount of ground balls. And I was looking at their projected lineup, the Rangers' projected lineup today, versus righties, and it's really not that impressive. I know last year they did struggle with righties. If we can pull up the overall team stats here versus righties last season, so a 25.3% K rate, only a 215 batting average, low ISO, and only a 78 WRC plus. And looking at my daily team sheet here, which is something you would get access to. I do update this every single day. So last year versus righties, their numbers were 21st in batting average, 26th in WOBA, 24th in ISO, 27th in WRC plus, and pretty much bottom half in the league in most categories, third in K rate, although it is pulling in a Charlie Culberson 3 plate appearance sample size. So if you take that out, they're still kind of below average for the most part when it comes to strikeouts. Or I guess I should say above average, because we'd want them to be above average in strikeouts for our pitchers. So I think this is a pretty beatable spot here for Joe Musgrove. He does grade out very well for me. Probably my favorite SP2 on the entire slate if you're looking for a mid-range guy in the $8,000 range. And then Tyler Mahle here. Tyler Mahle. I've always forgot how to pronounce his name, but I know it's one of those two. But either way, I think he's a solid option here versus Arizona. They did lose Ketel Marte. He is now on the IL. I think it's a 10-day IL, so that's pretty much their best hitter. So when you take him out of the equation in a lineup that already wasn't that great, just gets an even better matchup here. But looking at Mahle's numbers last season, they have a 30% K rate. He does walk a lot of guys, and he will give some lefty power. That's kind of the only issue with him. But if the strikeouts can be there today, which they were in his first start where he struck out 9 versus St. Louis, that's not a bad price point at $7,500. He only has a 4.2 implied team total against him. Is a slight favorite and a 6.5K prop over in Vegas, which is the most of all these pitchers that we've talked about so far. So if he can get like 6 to 8 strikeouts in this game, maybe give up a couple runs and be in line for a win, that's not a bad day at $7,500. So I do think he is totally viable there. And again, with Ketel Marte out of the lineup, it definitely softens some things up for him as well. But I think that's going to be it for the pitchers. I didn't really have much interest in anybody else. I'm going to stick with these 4 as of right now. Again, things can change throughout the day, but typically they don't for my pitchers. I kind of usually keen on the pitchers. Now the bats will change for me throughout the day sometimes when I see team totals shifting or some news drops with lineups. But for the most part, probably going to stick with this core group of pitchers. So let's move on to the bats at this point. Alright, so before we get into the bats, I do want to mention that there's some conflicting news about the Blue Jays starter today. So DraftKings has Steven Matz as the projected starter, but I was reading a tweet from a beat reporter for the Blue Jays last night about 14 hours ago. He said that TJ Zeuch's likely to start tomorrow as long as things don't go crazy tonight, and TJ Zeuch did not come in and pitch in that game, so he should be good to go. And he says Steven Matz will pitch on Saturday, so let's just assume that TJ Zeuch is the pitcher tonight. If it happened to be Steven Matz for some reason, I don't think it is, but if it happened to be, just DraftKings is throwing me off having Matz as the projected starter. I would prefer the righties over some lefties that I do have listed here. But let's just roll with the news that TJ Zeuch is our starter, and we can adjust throughout the day if it happens to change. But anyway, I have all cheap catchers here listed. I think it's just a good position to spend down on because I don't really want to spend up for a catcher today because it looks like I'm going to be in the 8 and 9K range for my pitchers, and there's some other really good spots here like Mike Trout, the guy I really want to play today. So I'm just going to pretty much spend down for catcher unless some things happen to go crazy and change for me throughout the day, but looking like a good spend down spots. So we'll start up top here with Max Stassie at $3,000. I prefer him versus lefties. He has much more power versus them, around a 360 ISO last season. The ISO dips into the 100s versus righties, but this park that Toronto's playing in right now, looking like a very hitter-friendly park, and I believe there was 12 runs scored yesterday, so I definitely want bats in this game. It looks like a very hitter-friendly park, so I'm going to buy into that, and he's just a cheap part of the Angel stack, which there's no implied team total out yet. Maybe it's because of the conflicting news of either Matz or TJ Zeuch, but I'm thinking it's going to be one of the higher totals in the entire site, the Angels and the Blue Jays, so I'm definitely wanting to get bats from that game as of right now. Then Tucker Barnhart, $2,600. The Cincinnati Reds have been on absolute fire to start the season so far. Now, they have been playing in Cincinnati's park, which is great for hitting. They now moved to Arizona, but it's still not that bad of a hitter's park, and they do have a team total close to 5 here versus Taylor Widener, which looking at his numbers last season, it wasn't a very large sample size. He only pitched 20 innings last year, but he had a 5.56 xFIP, or 5.65 xFIP, I should say. A nice K rate, but a 14% walk rate, and gave up a 260 ISO. And if you're looking at the lefties, a 353 ISO given up and a 7.51 xFIP. The strikeout rate was still there, but a high walk rate as well. It's only an 8-inning sample size, so I hate to put too much into that, but it definitely looks like we can target some lefties here for the Reds, and they've been red hot to start the season. No pun intended there, but Tucker Barnhart, he's always been a cheap catcher that we can always play when there's a righty on the mound for Cincinnati, so $2,600. I think he's a fine option. And Alejandro Kirk, $2,400. I know Andrew Heaney's a pitcher that has decent strikeout numbers, but he can give up plenty of power to both sides of the plate. If we look at his numbers versus right-handed pitching last season, he gave up a 207 ISO, 443 slugging, and a 43% fly ball rate with a 45% hard contact rate. Did have a nice 25% K rate, but he will give up plenty of power to both sides of the plate, especially righty. So Alejandro Kirk, he has a very small sample size last year. I think he only had 25 plate appearances, but at 375 batting average, 418 WOBA, and a 166 WRC plus with an OPS near 1,000. Didn't really strike out much either. So if you want to stack some Blue Jays up, or if you're just looking for a cheap catcher, I think Kirk checks the bill there at that really low price point. He's got some upside there as well. And then dropping down to first base, we have Eric Hosmer at $5,500. That is a massive price point, so I'm probably not going to get there in cash games. Probably more so just Padres stacks, but I know they don't have Fernando Tatis, which is their best player, but they still have a really good lineup. Trent Grisham's expected to be activated from the IL today, so he should be back in the lineup, probably in the leadoff spot. You got Tommy Pham, Manny Machado, Eric Hosmer, we just talked about, Jake Cronenworth, Erickson Profar. It's still a pretty good lineup, even though their best player is out. So we can still stack them up, and Vegas would agree. They have one of the higher implied team totals in the entire slate at 5.16 right now. They're going up against Ari Hara. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He wasn't terrible in his first start, but he didn't really strike at anybody. I think he only had one strikeout. And the Padres can make plenty of contact, and they have plenty of power. So I don't think it's going to be the best start for him, especially if he's not going to miss any bats. But Eric Hosmer's not a guy that really strikes out too much. He's got plenty of power versus both lefties and righties, specifically versus righties. So if you want to stack up the Padres, I have no issue with that whatsoever. His numbers versus righties last year, he had a 330 batting average, 409 WOBA, 160 WRC plus, and an ISO creeping up to the 300 range. So I definitely think he is viable here. Shohei Ohtani at $4,600. Again, assuming Zoik's on the mound because he's a righty, I would really like Ohtani. If it happens to be Matz, I really wouldn't want to play Ohtani too much versus a lefty, but this is looking like a great park for hitting, and Ohtani's got plenty of power versus righties. It was a small sample size last year, but he wasn't great versus righties at all. 28.9% K rate, 289 WOBA, batting average below 200. But I think that's going to change this year. And he's already had, I know he had that one moonshot home run. I think it was either on, it was the day he was pitching. It was just beautiful. I think it was like 115 miles per hour off the bat. It was just an amazing sounding home run. So I like Ohtani there quite a bit. Definitely in on the Angels today. Then Vlad at $4,500. Again, I don't really like to pick on Andrew Heaney too much. So I'm not going to say I want to stack up the Blue Jays, but you can definitely use some power righties here because like I mentioned earlier with Kirk, Andrew Heaney gives up a lot of hard contact, a 45% hard contact rate and an ISO above 200. So even though the strikeouts are there, there's certainly some upside. We know Vlad's got all the power in the world, so I think he's totally viable if you're just looking for a few one-offs on Toronto, looking for power, upside, and a pretty good hitter's park in my opinion. Then going out of second base, we have Jose Altuve, $4,900. Probably would only get here in Houston stacks because of the price point, but they're looking like a good stack today versus the Oakland Athletics, who've really struggled so far to start the season. Sean Manaea did give up a few runs in his first start, didn't overall look that great. We know Jose Altuve, he's got some pretty good numbers versus left-handed pitching. Wasn't good last year, only a .083 ISO, 167 batting average, and a 25% K rate, but over the course of his career, he's always been pretty good versus lefties, and he's going to be leading off for the Astros, which does look like a decent stack today, so he's viable in that format, but probably not going to get there in cash games. Jake Cronenworth, $4,300. I wish he was going to be hitting a little bit higher in the order. Maybe he does. I guess we'll see what happens, but with Trent Grisham being back, he's probably going to be right in the middle or the bottom half of that order, which is still fine because this is a loaded lineup and there's going to be plenty of RBI opportunities. But Jake Cronenworth was great versus right-handed pitching last season, only a 12% K rate, PS close to 1,000, a 156 WRC plus, and ISO at 265 with a 316 batting average. So Cronenworth is certainly viable versus a guy that really didn't show much strikeout ability in his first start. I think he's going to obviously be better than that throughout the season. But I do think it was an encouraging sign for these Padres bats in this game, and I like their team total as well. Rangers Stadium. Then Josh Van Meter should be hitting near the top of the order with the news that Ketel Marte is now on the IL. He was hitting second yesterday in Coors Field, and if that doesn't change at $2,700, I think he's a fine option. I don't really want to pick on Malley too much because I do think he's a decent pitching option today, but if you're not using him in your lineup, Josh Van Meter is a really nice source of value here, and he's also eligible at third base as well. And I could see his ownership being a little bit high. I personally like playing Josh Van Meter versus righties because he does have power upside. Now, his overall numbers aren't that great, and he will strike out quite a bit, close to a 30% K rate to righties last season, only a 220 WOBA and a 150 ISO. But I remember there was a one stretch a couple years ago, might have been the year before that, when he was on the Reds. I was just clicking his name every time he was facing a righty, and he was going off for like a week. Now, obviously, it faded off. He's not he's not that great of a hitter, but he's totally viable here. And Malley's the guy that will struggle versus lefties, if anything. He's pretty good versus righties, but versus lefties, the walks get higher. He still had overall really strong numbers last year. It was only a 23 inning sample size, though, so. But over the course of his career, the past few seasons, he's been a guy that's really tough on righties, a lot of ground balls, but kind of weaker versus lefties in terms of walks and things like that. But he's mainly just a price play for the most part. Then dropping out of third base, we have Jose Ramirez at $5,700. We have not talked about any Indians yet, and no, I'm not being biased here, even though I got the Indian shirt, but they're in a pretty good spot versus Julio Teheran, who's just not that great of a pitcher, and he will struggle versus left-handed bats. And Jose Ramirez, he is obviously the best player on the Indians. He had double dunk performance recently, and he's just easily their best hitter. That's not the greatest team in the world these days. You know, back in the day, the past couple of years, they've been a team that you really didn't want to use pitchers against because they had a loaded lineup. You had Michael Brantley, Evan Encarnacion, Yan Gomes, Francisco Lindor, Ramirez, Michael Brantley, if I didn't mention him already. It was just a really good lineup, and those guys have sadly all gone away for the most part besides Jose Ramirez. So not the greatest lineup in the world, but they can definitely have some upside here versus Teheran. Not that great of a pitcher. Now, Jose Ramirez last year was insanely good versus left-handed pitching, like insanely good. He's still good versus righties, but the numbers weren't as good compared to the lefties. But still last year, a 362 WOBA to righties, a 259 ISO, a 259 batting average, a 128 WRC plus, a 235 ISO, strikeout rate below 20%, double-digit walk rate, and a lot of fly balls as well, 50% fly ball rate. And looking at Teheran's numbers last season versus the left-handed bats, at 11.21 ERA, a 10.66 xFIP, only an 11% K rate, and a walk rate of 14% with a 462 ISO given up and a 746 slugging. So yeah, sign me up for the lefties on the Indians today. You can use the righties as well, but the lefties specifically versus Julio are definitely in a really good spot. So I do like the Indians. I think they're one of the better stacks today. Their team total is sitting at 4.88 right now, but I would not be surprised if that creeps towards 5 or even higher by the time first pitch happens. So definitely not Ramirez if you got the money to spend up for him, or if you're just doing Indian stacks, you can't leave off their by far best player. Alex Bregman, $5,000 facing off versus a lefty. He's always in play versus lefties. Now, I'm not in love with Houston today, but I do like stacking them. I'm just not sure if I'm going to get to them because of their expensive price points of around $5,000 for both Altuve and Bregman, but he always has elite numbers versus left-handed pitcher. Not quite as good as Ramirez last year, but 319 batting average, only a 7% K rate, walks a lot as well. Not a lot of ground balls, 411 on base percentage, 574 slugging. You guys get the idea. Some pretty good numbers here for Alex Bregman. So if you got the money for him, or if you're just stacking up the Astros, he makes sense in that fashion. And then if you want a cheaper option, Mike Moustakas is totally viable hitting the middle of that order for the Cincinnati Reds, who've been on fire to start the season. Widener's numbers don't really scare me too much. I know it was a smaller sample size last year, but I think the Reds do have the advantage here, and they do have a team total close to 5, so I do think they can definitely get some runs in. And Mike Moustakas, plenty of RB opportunities, had an ISO close to 300 last year versus right-handed pitching, so you can sign me up for him if you are stacking up the Reds, or if you just want to look for a cheap one-off to get exposure to that Reds lineup, which has been pretty good so far to start the season. Then dropping down to shortstop, we have Bo Bichette at $4,700. Like I mentioned earlier multiple times already, I'm not really looking to stack against Heaney too much, but this does look like it's going to be a pretty good hitter's park, and Heaney will give up a lot of hard contact, a lot of power. Maybe will strike out guys, so there's always downside to stacking against him, but he will give up those fly balls and hard contact, which always are a good recipe for home runs. And Bo Bichette, plenty of power versus both lefties and righties, and I do like the Blue Jays today. No team total out yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's above. I think that Vegas is going to give Heaney some respect, so I'm not sure if it's going to be at 5 or above, but I think it's going to be in that mid-4s, maybe upper 4s, which is good enough for me. Could be 5, I'm not really sure yet, but we'll see how it looks. I do think he's a pretty solid option there. Eugenio Suarez, $4,400. Again, just cheap Reds exposure, kind of similar to Mike Moustakas. Now, he's not a lefty, so he's not going to have the platoon advantage there, but Suarez had plenty of power versus both righties and lefties last season. If we actually want to pull up his splits here, 259 ISO to right-handed pitching last season, only a 211 batting average and a near 30% K rate. Did walk quite a bit and a lot of fly balls, which is always nice, but the strikeouts are always a bit worrisome and the low batting average as well. But batting cleanup for the Reds, I think there's going to be plenty of upside there. You know, plenty of upside to knock in some runs, and always home run potential with Suarez as well. So, like the price point, I do think he is quite viable there. I think he was third. I think he was third base eligible on opening day, or at least a couple of days ago. So it kind of sucks that he lost the eligibility there, but he is a fine play at shortstop. And Kim, if you're looking for a cheap option, $3,100. If you can just get a cheap player on the San Diego Padres around $3,000 with a team total above 5, I think he makes sense for that. He's been the Tatis replacement. Obviously, he's not going to put up Tatis-like numbers, but he is viable if you just want a cheap Padre in your lineup at a position that I don't think is that great today. So Kim, he is there for salary relief only. don't expect too much out of him, but I mean, there's some RBI opportunity in a good lineup, so I think it's somewhat worth it if you need to go low at shortstop. Then dropping down to the outfield, we have the best player in baseball, Mike Trout, at $5,900, who had a great game yesterday. I know he went deep. I can't remember if he went deep twice in that game, but I know he had a really good game, and I haven't really been on Mike Trout this year. I have not played him yet, and I'm a guy that likes to play Mike Trout as often as I can. It just hasn't really been the opportunity to want to play him. He also hasn't been on some main slates as well. But whether it's Zoik or Steven Matz, we can play Mike Trout here. Like I mentioned earlier, looks like it's going to be a pretty good hitter's park here for Toronto Stadium that they're playing in right now. Would not be surprised if the Angels have a team total north of 5. They're pretty much one of my favorite stacks on the entire slate as of right now. I'm not sure that's really going to change throughout the day, but it's Mike Trout. I can read you guys the numbers, but I'm not sure I have to tell you that Mike Trout's a good baseball player. But if you want me to tell you the numbers versus righties, he's amazing. Low strikeout rate, 15% walk rate, 370 ISO last season, 433 WOBA. He crushes right-handed pitching, so I would prefer Zoik on the mound. He's actually a little bit worse versus lefties, but his worst is better than almost a lot of players versus left-handed pitching. So Mike Trout, this is one of those slates where I'm really trying to find the money to be able to fit him in. He's my favorite spend up bat on the entire slate. I know, hot take, Mike Trout's a good spend up, but in my opinion, I'm really trying to get him in my lineups today, cash and tournaments. Then going down to the mid-range, because I don't want to list a bunch of expensive outfielders, because I'm really trying to get in on Mike Trout today. Trent Grisham is expected to be activated off the IL. I think I mentioned that earlier, and I would assume he's going to be in the leadoff spot, especially with Tatis out, and Tommy Pham's a righty, so I'm assuming Trent Grisham should slide in that leadoff spot, and they have a nice team total above 5 today, and he's got some decent splits here versus right-handed pitching. I like that entire Padres lineup today, especially in tournaments if you want to stack them up, but last year versus righties, he had a 245 batting average, which isn't great, but a 226 ISO, a 126 WRC plus, and on base percentage north of 350 with a really good walk rate as well. So Trent Grisham, love that price point. It would be a very solid play on this slate as long as he is leading off, or at least in the top half of that order. But I assume he would be leading off today. Eddie Rosario, $4,300. I mentioned this earlier with Jose Ramirez, but Tehran sucks versus left-handed bats. He has for quite some time now. So Rosario batting cleanup for the Indians as a left-handed bat. I think he makes plenty of sense. He's also a big fly ball guy, and Tehran is as well. All right, just pulling up his splits versus righties, a 50% fly ball rate, which I think is right on par with Jose Ramirez. 284 ISO to righties, only a 14% K rate, so I can definitely get on Rosario here. I think he's one of the best outfield plays on the slate. Framil Reyes, he's just righty power versus Tehran. I know I prefer the lefties versus him, but I do like the power upside, and he actually has had more power versus righties the past couple of seasons, so I wouldn't want to, if you're stacking the Indians, don't leave off Reyes because he's got some of the most power upside in that entire lineup. Then Tommy Pham, $3,700, should be hitting near the top of the order. I know he's a righty, but so he's not going to be leading off here. If he was a lefty, I'd assume he'd be leading off, but still $3,700 for one of the top stacks on the entire slate. He's good versus righties and lefties, and Ari Hara didn't really do any strikeout damage in his first start, and I'm not sure he's really going to carve up the Padres lineup here, even without Tatis. So do like Pham here quite a bit if you're just stacking up the Padres, or if you just want a cheap to mid-range bat in your lineup for cash games. Tyler Naquin, $3,200, former Indian, but he's been tearing the cover off the ball so far to start the season. He's had a great start, and he's just kind of cheap lefty power, or just a cheap lefty bat, I should say, versus Taylor Widener, who's not a pitcher that really scares me too much, and he should be leading off here for the Cincinnati Reds, so I think he makes sense for the price tag. Then Ben Gamel, $2,800, just cheap and leading off for the Indians, more than likely, versus Julio Tehran, who does struggle versus left-handed bats. The numbers aren't going to look super impressive for Gamel, but if you are stacking up the Indians, he should be leading off, and he's a lefty versus Tehran, but that's what I want in my lineups today. So, yeah, guys, I think that's going to be it for the video, so I hope it was helpful, and if it was, please leave a like down below, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, leave your comments, feedback, all that fun stuff down in the comments. If you want to help support the channel over on Patreon, link is down below for that. If you want access to the optimizer, you can do stacks on there. It's got ownership projections, all my projections, the rankings, cheat sheets, data sheets, all that fun stuff is available as well. Discord community where we're talking there baseball the entire day. It's always a good time in there. But yeah, we had a couple takedowns yesterday as well, so it was fun to see. It was a good day. We had a lot of Lance Lynn, which I'm sure most of you guys did as well. But Lance Lynn had an amazing performance, around 50 DraftKings points, easily the best performance of the entire season so far. But yeah, that's going to be it, guys. I'll see you guys in the next video, and I wish you guys the best of luck, and wherever you live, hope the weather is wonderful. Enjoy the sun, and I'll see you guys in the next video.